The death of transgender man Sam Nordquist, tortured and killed in New York. The tragic death of 24-year-old Sam Nordquist has sent shockwaves across the nation. A transgender man from Minnesota, Sam was reported missing after traveling to New York in late 2024. What his family and friends didn't know was that he had been subjected to over a month of unimaginable torture before his body was discovered in a field in Yates County, New York. His case is not just another crime story. It is a horrifying account of prolonged abuse, betrayal, and ultimate murder. Sam's death has ignited widespread outrage, not just in the LGBTQ+ community, but among all those who demand justice for victims of extreme violence. Authorities have since arrested 7 individuals linked to his killing. While the suspects are facing second-degree murder charges, officials have controversially stated that they do not consider it a hate crime. But what really happened to Sam Nordquist? This is his story. Before we dive in, if you want to stay updated on true crime cases like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Now, let's get into the case. Sam Nordquist was a 24-year-old transgender man from Minnesota, known for his kind nature and strong sense of self. He had recently been exploring online relationships and in late 2024 made the life-changing decision to travel to Canandaigua, New York, to meet someone he had been talking to for months. His family was hesitant about the trip, but Sam assured them that he would be safe and planned to return home within 2 weeks. However, something went terribly wrong. Sam maintained regular contact with his family at first, sending messages and checking in. But after January 1st, 2025, all communication suddenly stopped. His family grew increasingly worried. Days turned into weeks with no response. And by early February, his loved ones knew something was seriously wrong. On February 9th, 2025, Sam's family officially reported him missing. At this point, their worst fears had started to set in. They pleaded with authorities to investigate, and the search for Sam intensified. 4 days later, on February 13th, investigators discovered a horrifying scene. A body dumped in a rural field in Yates County, New York. The remains were in such a condition that it took time to confirm the identity. Eventually, authorities identified the victim as Sam Nordquist. But the most disturbing part of this case was yet to be revealed. Sam hadn't just been killed. He had been tortured for over a month before his death. The brutality of what he endured left both law enforcement and the public shaken. Now all attention turned to the people who had last seen him alive. Who was responsible for this horrifying act, and why did they do it? What investigators uncovered about Sam Nordquist's final weeks was nothing short of horrifying. After arriving in Canandaigua, New York, Sam had planned to stay briefly with people he thought were friends. But instead of a warm welcome, he walked straight into a nightmare. Over several weeks, Sam was held against his will, repeatedly beaten, tortured, and sexually assaulted. The abuse was systematic and cruel. Reports indicate he was beaten with blunt objects, burned, and subjected to psychological torment. His captors withheld food and water, leaving him physically weak and unable to escape. One of the most chilling aspects of the case is how many people were involved. Investigators believe that at least 7 people participated in his torture. They not only abused Sam, but also reportedly filmed parts of the ordeal, using his suffering as a form of entertainment. As the abuse continued, Sam's condition worsened. His body was covered in bruises, fractures, and untreated injuries. He was deprived of medical attention, and instead of showing mercy, his attackers escalated their violence. Eventually, Sometime in early February 2025, Sam succumbed to his injuries, but instead of alerting authorities, his killers treated his death as an inconvenience. They disposed of his body in a remote field in Yates County, leaving him to rot in the cold winter air. Days passed before the authorities discovered his remains. By then, his body was in such a state that identifying him took extra time. But once the connection was made, the truth about Sam's disappearance started to unravel. The case sent shockwaves through the community. How could this level of sadistic violence happen? And why wasn't there any attempt to classify it as a hate crime, given the brutal and prolonged nature of the attack? Authorities were quick to take action, rounding up suspects who had been involved. But when the details of the arrests emerged, the case took an even more unexpected turn. As soon as Sam Nordquist's body was discovered on February 13, 2025, investigators launched an urgent probe into his disappearance and murder. The forensic evidence at the scene suggested his body had been dumped several days earlier, which led authorities to believe that multiple people were involved in both his death and the attempt to cover it up. Detectives traced Sam's last known movements, reviewing phone records, social media interactions, and surveillance footage. Their investigation quickly led them to a group of 7 individuals, all of whom had direct contact with Sam in the weeks leading up to his murder. By mid-February, police arrested 7 suspects, all of whom were charged with second-degree murder, unlawful imprisonment, and other felony offences. The group was believed to have played different roles in the prolonged abuse and eventual killing of Sam. What shocked the public even more was the background of these suspects. Some of them were known members of the LGBTQ+ community, which led authorities to reject classifying the crime as a hate crime, a decision that sparked immediate backlash. Many argued that the sheer brutality and targeted nature of the attack pointed to deep-seated prejudice, regardless of the attackers' identities. Law enforcement officials, however, maintained their stance, stating that there was no concrete evidence that the attack was motivated purely by Sam's gender identity. Instead, they described it as a sadistic act of violence fueled by manipulation, groupthink, and cruelty. Despite the arrests, the community wanted more answers. What drove these individuals to commit such a prolonged and torturous crime? Was this a case of premeditated murder, or had Sam become the victim of a situation that spiraled out of control? Sam Nordquist's death sent shockwaves across the country, particularly within LGBTQ+ communities. His murder wasn't just another crime, it was a brutal, prolonged act of torture that left many questioning how something so horrific could happen in 2025. Vigils were held in both Minnesota and New York, with hundreds of people gathering to mourn Sam and demand justice. The pain was particularly deep for Black transgender activists, who pointed out that trans individuals, especially trans people of color, face higher rates of violence and murder. Advocacy groups immediately called for hate crime charges, arguing that Sam was targeted because of his gender identity, regardless of the background of his attackers. Social media became flooded with posts using #JusticeForSam, pushing for authorities to reconsider their decision. However, law enforcement stood firm, maintaining that while the crime was heinous, it did not meet the legal threshold for a hate crime. Many activists disagreed, arguing that transgender individuals often fall through the cracks in the justice system. Beyond legal battles, Sam's case reignited conversations about safety for trans people, especially when meeting people online. Some organizations pushed for increased protections, such as crisis support programs for LGBTQ plus individuals at risk. Despite the tragedy, Sam's story became a rallying cry for awareness and action. His family and supporters vowed to keep fighting, not just for justice in his case, but for broader protections for transgender people across the country. Sam Nordquist's murder was more than just a crime. It was an act of unimaginable cruelty that lasted for over a month. While his killers now face justice, questions remain about the true motivations behind the attack and why it wasn't classified as a hate crime. His death serves as a stark reminder of the violence that transgender individuals, especially people of color, continue to face. As his family and community fight for change, one thing is certain: Sam's story will not be forgotten. If you want to stay updated on cases like this, subscribe and turn on notifications to never miss an important story.